Good morning, and welcome to the discussion of the last of our ethical theories, divine command theory. You'll notice that I'm staring over a background of Mount Sinai from the Holy Land, and this is actually a very appropriate place to begin a discussion of divine command theory, because possibly the first divine command theory of ethics in human history began here. It was on Mount Sinai that the Jews believed that Moses received the 10 Commandments from God. Well, what is this except a form of divine command theory? 10 commandments that God gave to Moses to give to the Jewish people. And so standing here as we discuss divine command theory seems like an appropriate thing to do. Now, divine command theory does something none of our other ethical theories have done. It attempts to solve some of the problems of ethics by bringing God into the equation. That's a little unusual in the discussion we've had. It also may be a little uncomfortable. In our secular society, we're very inclined to leave God out of discussions like this, and for understandable reasons. Obviously, the moment you bring God into a discussion on ethics, you have to be concerned that, well, is this theory going to be persuasive to people who don't believe in God? And even among people who do believe in God, they disagree on what God commands. There are different versions of God. The Christian version of God is very different from, for instance, the Muslim version of God, or say different Buddhist conceptions of God. And so what should we believe about that? We'll keep these problems in mind for later, but we'll begin with a discussion of what divine command theory seems like it could do and could do well before we, in the next video, get to discussions of the problems associated with it and if those problems are or are not solvable. So, basic definition, divine command theory refers to the attempt to base moral commands or moral values and moral duties in the commands of a God. Now, the great strength of divine command theory is that it possibly provides a solution to the grounding problem, which has been plaguing us throughout our discussion of all these different ethical theories. And yet, it may provide a solution even more basic than that. Think back to Gyges from the beginning of the year. You have this shepherd, a peasant, a nobody. He happens to witness some sort of earthquake, a cavern opens up, a hole into the ground. He descends where he finds a skeleton of a dead king. And on that king, his eye is drawn to a ring on the king's finger. Takes that ring, puts it on, and discovers that it's a ring of invisibility. Immediately, Gyges thinks, wow, with this power of invisibility, I could do incredible things. And he does do incredible things, incredibly bad things. He goes into the capital. He seduces the queen after sneaking his way into the palace. He murders the king, and he becomes king himself. He lives a long and prosperous life. He never pays for any of his crimes before he dies of old age. Why was Gyges wrong? Well, divine command theory potentially provides a reason. Now, all the ethical theories can provide a reason why he was wrong. Utilitarianism could say, well, he failed to maximize the greater good. Natural law theory says, well, he failed to respect the natural good of life of the king. He killed an innocent person, and that was wrong. And all of the other theories could say the same thing. Kant could say, well, he treated the king and his wife as means to a mere end, not as ends of themselves. Okay, you tell Gyges this, and Gyges says, whatever, I don't care. What could you say to Gyges at that point? And it almost seems like there's nothing. None of the other ethical theories offer us anything. Here, divine command theory possibly does, because divine command theory potentially provides not only a basis for ethics, but a system of accountability. We'll talk about that later. So let's begin with the grounding problem. This is a problem that every ethical theory runs into. how do you ultimately ground ethics? Now, utilitarianism says, well, right and wrong is based on whatever maximizes well-being for the greatest number of people possible. That's fine, but what grounds that? Why should I want to maximize well-being for the greatest number of people possible? Or what about Kant? Kant says it is wrong to treat a person as a means and not as an ends also. Why? Why shouldn't I treat somebody as a means to an end? Natural law says there are these certain basic goods: life and health, beauty, knowledge, procreation, education, and beauty, and the search for meaning. Okay, why are they goods? And even if they are goods, how does this mean I should act in a certain way? Virtue ethics says the virtues are good: courage and justice and prudence and temperance and generosity and kindness. But why? What makes those good? Why are they goods? What makes the good things good? And why should I follow them anyway? So, and what's more, let's suppose we get that far. Let's suppose I accept these values. Let's suppose I accept the values of goodness and kindness and generosity, or life and health and knowledge. Why does this mean I have to do anything? How does the mere existence of certain goods result in an obligation on me? See, there's a difference between moral values and moral duties. Moral values are things like goodness and kindness and justice. Moral duties are commands or requirements that we have to obey. And moral duties typically derive from authority. If I'm driving down the road and I see flashing lights and hear a siren behind me, I have to pull over. Why? Because a policeman has the authority to order me to pull over. A command from the policeman is binding on me. Well, some normal person, not a policeman, tries to pull me over or signals me to pull over, I'm under no obligation to pull over. Why? Such a person has no authority. So moral commands seem to be related to authority. And this is possibly something that divine command theory draws on. Now, historically, morality and religion were very separate. This idea that morality and religion can be related is actually relatively recent in human history. This might seem surprising, but it's actually not hard to understand. If you think about what most religion for most of human history was, ancient polytheism. Think about the Greek gods, for example, to take the most popular account. Well, there was no connection between morality and religion in ancient Greece, because for the simple reason the Greek gods were not moral gods. Zeus did not issue moral commands to people. Zeus never gave out any 10 commandments. Zeus didn't care if people behaved morally, because Zeus himself was not a moral being. He slept with his own sister. He killed people on a whim because he became cranky. He demanded sacrifice from human beings, and if he didn't get respect, he got very angry. Zeus was not the sort of god that was a great example of morality himself, and being not a great example of morality, he did not issue moral commands to people. Zeus did not care what human beings did. As long as Zeus himself got respect and sacrifice, he was happy. And what's more, this wasn't just the Greek gods, this was most polytheistic gods. And what's worse, some gods were even worse than Zeus. The Aztec god Huitzilopochtli was so bad, he once murdered 500 of his brothers and sisters. And the last of his sisters, he killed by taking a flaming serpent, which he then used to cut her head off, sending her still twitching body crashing down a mountain. In memory of that, the Aztecs would sacrifice hundreds of human beings, human victims, to their gods every day, following the example of Huitzilopochtli. Again, when your gods are not good examples of moral behavior, you can't really base morality in them. This changes with the development of ancient Judaism. In the Exodus story in the Old Testament, the Jews believe that their God and their prophet Moses brought them out of the land of slavery in Egypt. Now, having been brought out of the land of slavery, they establish a covenant with their God, a mutually binding agreement. The ground rules for this covenant were the Ten Commandments. Moses brought the Jewish people to the foot of Mount Sinai, while he went up the mountain as a prophet to talk to God. 3 days later, he brought down from that mountain the Ten Commandments, this first system of morality and moral rules that came from God. And there's nothing particularly shocking in them. It orders the Israelites, the early Jews, to respect God, to keep holy the Sabbath day, not to take God's name in vain. It orders people to respect their parents, not to kill or steal or commit adultery, all the things Zeus did on a regular basis. And so suddenly we are in a different era. Now, the Jews could do this because they did not think their God was like, say, Zeus or the other polytheistic gods. They have a different concept of God, a concept of a God who cares about human beings for their own sake. And when you have this different type of God, you can have a morality that is based in God. You had a God who was himself, the Jews believed, one, a moral being, and two, a God who cared about human beings. And obviously the Christians, early Christians, take this over. And it's with this background in mind that certain Christian thinkers developed the belief in divine command theory. Now, it should be pointed out at this point that this is actually not a religious people versus atheist issue. There are Christians and Jews who don't believe in divine command theory. Peter Van Inwagen and Swinburne are two famous Christian philosophers, but they don't believe they can base morality in God. They think morality is independent of God. It's not a problem for them. At the same time, there are atheists who think, well, we don't believe in God, so we don't believe there's a morality. But if there was a God, this actually probably could solve some problems. So it's not outright a Christian or atheist issue, but obviously it becomes related to that. Now, what divine command theory says is that right and wrong are based in God's commandments. So it distinguishes, on one hand, between moral values and moral duties. Now, moral values are things like goodness and justice and honesty. Moral duties are things we have to do. So a moral value would be honesty. A moral duty would be tell the truth. A value would be life. A duty would be don't kill the innocent or respect life. So values and duties are very closely related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Now, what divine command theory says, and there are different versions of divine command theory actually, but what divine command theory, the version we're talking about, says is that moral values are based in God's nature, that God's nature is goodness. So these things we call values, like courage and kindness and generosity, are based in God's nature, and that moral duties are based in God's commands. God, based on his nature, commands people to do certain things. He commands them to respect their parents, not kill, steal, commit adultery, 10 Commandments. And these commands are the duties, the things we have to do. This has certain advantages, and we'll talk about those advantages before talking about problems in the next video. The first advantage is this might solve the grounding problem. Again, might, pending future discussion. It seems to provide a solid, non-arbitrary stopping point for the grounding problem. Why are the virtues good? Because they're based in God's nature, and God himself is essentially good. So it's a very solid stopping point where you can't go any deeper than that. So that might be attractive. Again, if it works. It also potentially has another advantage. it potentially provides something that none of the other theories have, which is moral accountability. What happens to someone like Gyges? Nothing. He lives his life. Yes, he's behaved in an unethical fashion, but he feels no guilt. He's perfectly happy. Or what about people like Stalin, who have lived horrible lives, but there are no consequences for them? Good for them. Or what about good people who come to unpleasant ends or who suffer? Is there nothing more we can say to them? Well, what divine command theory says is that there is actually moral accountability possible because there is a God to provide moral accountability, a God who will, in the next life, if not in this life, punish the guilty and reward the good. And so that in that sense, death isn't the last word, and that this life is not the last word. And so there is actually an accountability beyond the grave. And so this might seem to some people more satisfying than letting the apparent injustices of this world be the final answer. So in this video, we've looked at a brief introduction to divine command theory. We've given a definition of it. Divine command theory is this attempt to base right and wrong in divine commands. We've talked about it historically, how you can't really have a divine command theory in most ancient polytheistic religions, but with the new Jewish and eventually Christian concept of God, divine command theory develops. We've talked about the difference between moral values and moral duties, and some of the possible advantages of divine command theory. In our next video, we'll talk about some of the problems associated with divine command theory and see if we think it can stand up to those or not.